Thanks very much, and I appreciate the opportunity to talk about something that's very dear to my heart, and that is not only gardening, but the conservation of our precious water resources. And I wanted to start with this particular slide, that this is a garden that I designed here in Fort Collins I think I was installed in 99 or 2000. And wanted to start with this image to dispel any notion that that Xeriscape is yucca plants and rock, or is bleak and dry, or anything like that. That you can achieve the same kind of lushness that you can see in any gardens anywhere in the world, and it can be beautiful, and it can be reflective of our unique regional style here in northern Colorado. So as Lou mentioned, I studied at the Arnold Arboretum of Harvard University, and if you look at the picture on the left, those are the kind of gardens, perennial gardens, that I created in New England, where there are probably 45 to 55 inches of rain a year. And in many ways, it's very much like the climate in the British Isles. It's misty and it's cool, and the leaves get very big, and flowers grow very tall. Well, obviously, that's not the climate that we have here. The upper right-hand side is Barbara Bush's garden. I just wanted to share a picture of that. And one thing I'd like to point out for people who are interested in plant conservation and native plants and invasive plants, that there are some very bad and naughty plants in that garden. And so part of what I want to talk about is I have the belief that if we live long enough, we can eventually correct some of our bigger mistakes that we made along the way. And I think that obviously that's part of gardening. It's a learning experience, and we experiment and make mistakes. And one of the things is figuring out what works and what's really suitable in the region that we're gardening. I spent 6 years in Austin, Texas, which is where all the cool kids are this week at the South by Southwest Music Festival. But Austin, Texas is one place I wanted to share this slide, because Austin is a place that over the last 15 or 20 years has really been able to develop a unique regional style that is identifiable. When you see a picture of a garden in Austin, you can recognize the plants, and you can recognize the hill country limestone. And I think that that's an important concept for our region, and something I'm going to keep coming back to, is how do we identify a Colorado garden or a Western garden? What unique attributes do we have that are distinct from any other region? And for 5 years, I lived and worked at the Shambhala Mountain Center in Red Feather Lakes. Has anyone ever been up to visit the Shambhala Mountain Center? So maybe about half the people. Shambhala Mountain Center is a retreat center that offers yoga and meditation retreats, and various arts and education and so on. And I was the land steward there, so I built 6 miles of trails and patios and gardens. And this is a place where, for me, landscape design became very much about native plants. And I've always loved native plants and been interested in wildflowers and so on. But at 8,000 feet in Colorado, you have to become intimately acquainted with native plants, and your plant palette is much more limited to what our region can support. The High Plains Environmental Center is a nonprofit 501c3 that was created as part of the Centera development, with the idea that we would own and manage the land surrounding Houts Reservoir and Equalizer Lake. And those, Lou was talking about the history of the Colorado water system and irrigation water and so on. These two lakes were dug to hold irrigation water. Subsequently, they have become a significant habitat for migratory waterfowl. And there's sort of an unusual symbiotic relationship here between development and the business community and an environmental center at the High Plains Environmental Center, and a model that we think is worthy of being replicated elsewhere. And it's far from the 1970s version of environmentalist versus business, but actually sharing ideas and working collaboratively and finding win-win solutions where we can sustain and even restore and create natural areas that didn't exist before in the midst of urban development. So our mission is to engage developers, builders, businesses, and residents in making their community a living laboratory that provides integrated, leading-edge examples of community design, land stewardship, eco-literacy, and sustainable living that are grounded in reality and replicable. So with St. Patrick's Day coming up this week, I thought I would use this slide. And is anyone Irish here? 4.5 million people live in Ireland today, but 1 million Irish people emigrated to the United States in between 1950 or after 1850. And now 36.9 million Americans identify themselves as being of Irish heritage. And the reason I'm putting this slide up here is Ireland gets 50 to 80 inches of rain a year. In the West Coast, in West Cork, where the palm trees grow, they get 80 inches of rain, which is obviously about an inch and a quarter of rain a week. My theory is, and this is somewhat being the amateur sociologist here, when I was in Ireland and took this picture in 2008, it felt very much at home. More than being my home, it felt like the very climate and landscape that my DNA was made out of. And so there's a natural sense that we unconsciously keep trying to replicate this. I think that what we're doing here on the Front Range is trying to create places that look like Ireland, England, Germany, and France, and places where a lot of our ancestors came from. And we're doing it unconsciously, and it's coming at an enormous cost, because this is where we actually live. and we get 10 to 14 inches of rain in a good year. And so this is not an ugly landscape, it's a beautiful landscape. There's beautiful plants here, the weather is fantastic, but it has its own way of doing things. And obviously, Native Americans understood how to work with this landscape. The Ute Indian tribe is known to have existed in Colorado for at least 10,000 years. And in the southwest corner of the state, down by Mesa Verde, 800 to 1,000 years ago, there were more people living there than are living there now. So they managed to live with this landscape without really dismantling the ecosystem. And I think we could learn a lot from the indigenous cultures who lived here, because we have radically altered this landscape. And they say, a lot of indigenous people around the world say we actually dreamed this world into existence. And looking at this picture, I have to ask the question, what kind of dream are we having? It's kind of a nightmare in my view. So 98% of the lower 48 states has been altered for human use. That means it's been mined, farmed, logged, or paved and developed in other ways, 98%. So the idea that we had as pioneers coming to this land, that there's a vast, inexhaustible landscape out there is over. There is not an inexhaustible landscape left. So the nature that we have to preserve is really in our communities, in our own backyard, literally. 43,480 square miles have been paved, and 63,000 square miles are in irrigated turf grass. And the source of that is from a book called Bringing Nature Home by Douglas Tallamy, a entomologist. So it comes down to the aesthetic question, what is beautiful? And We've put a lot of effort into creating landscapes that look like the left-hand side of this slide. And yet, on the right-hand side of this slide are landscapes that I think are more interesting and more beautiful, and certainly are a lot more diverse. And if you asked which one of these supports any kind of biodiversity, where might you find birds living, or where would you find butterflies or other pollinators, it's far more likely you would find them in a diverse plant community that you see on the right-hand side. The landscape on the left, however, does have some ecosystem services. There are some things that turf grass does that are beneficial, ecologically speaking. One of those is it does sequester carbon. So turf grass will take carbon out of the air and lock it into the ground. And also, when we get a big storm event, this irrigated turf grass is able to absorb a lot of the rainfall. I mean, obviously, pavement and rooftops are not able to absorb all of that rainfall. And actually, the place to store water is in the ground, not in ponds, because it evaporates more slowly from being stored in the ground. These are some of the chemicals that are used to support turf grass, because there are many pests and insect pests and diseases that will attack turf grass. And I'm just going to read some statistics here. 78 million households in the US use home and garden pesticides. More pesticides and fertilizers applied to turf grass than any other crop. 3.2 pounds per acre versus 2.7 in agriculture. And as far as the nitrogen, the soluble nitrogen that we put onto turf grass to keep it green, a large amount of that finds its way into our waterways and causes a lot of problems there. On average, lawns receive twice the amount of herbicides and pesticides per square foot as any other crop in the US. And it's estimated that 7 million birds die each year from ingesting granular pesticide applications on American lawns. That statistic comes from the Audubon Society. And as many as 5 million people are poisoned by pesticides worldwide each year, the majority of which are young children. Lawnmowers, since lawnmowers are not regulated in the same way that other engines like your car are, they pollute at about 100 times the rate of the average car and are responsible for 3% of the world's CO2 emissions. And that statistic comes from Briggs & Stratton, the people who make these engines. 800 million gallons of gasoline are used every year to operate lawnmowers. So we're talking about all kinds of ways of getting more petroleum products, oil shale, the pipeline from Canada, and so on. But conservation should at least be part of this discussion. And 800 million gallons of gas, is that a good use of that resource? I think it's questionable. And on the average, mowing grass for 1 hour causes as much pollution as driving 650 miles. The question I'm posing here is, how do you measure the value of a river? So this is the Poudre River, and we have had this debate in Fort Collins for a decade or 2 decades about dam the Poudre, save the Poudre. But my question is, are we really asking the right question? And I think the question is, what do we need all this water for? And 1 square foot of lawn requires 20 gallons of water per year. 60% of residential water use here on the Front Range, which averages about 150 gallons of water per person per day, 60% of that goes to irrigating landscapes. Every year, billions of gallons of water are used here in Fort Collins to sustain landscaping. I ask you, is that a good use for this precious resource? And will future generations ask us why we weren't more prudent in drying up that river needlessly? Now, if the question was, should we take this river, use all the water to grow all the food that we eat in northern Colorado, that may be a good reason. But just to support turf grass, I think archaeologists in the future will look back at this culture and wonder, what did they use all this green grass for? Because we don't eat it, and it's very little value, actually. You know that there are projects planned for the Cache-la-Poudre River that will further constrict the flows of that river. And the result of that will be the water will warm up and will not support trout any longer, and will really reduce what that river that is already greatly diminished from what it used to be to a trickle. And a river needs to move and needs to be able to change its banks, and the spring crest, what the early explorers and trappers called the June rise, when all the snow melts, was so intense at one time that it would tear out the cottonwood trees going all the way down the river, and there was a wide floodplain. If you live anywhere basically north of here in Fort Collins, up in the whole Old Town area, was a huge floodplain with a forest of cottonwood trees. Basically that's how the white man found it, and so we have radically altered that river already. And so the question is, and I'm not saying we should do this or that with the river, just questioning, is this a good use for the life of this river? The monoculture of turf grass that we have created has also drastically diminished the habitat for wildlife. I mentioned pollinators such as birds and butterflies. And the Audubon Society, in their survey within the last decade, found that there were 60% less birds in Colorado, just total numbers of birds, than there were 40 years ago. So within most of our lifetime, more than half of the birds are gone. And that is largely due to lack of habitat. So I think also in landscaping, if we are landscaping with wildlife in mind, we could make a huge impact on wildlife and preserving our unique native biodiversity in Colorado. We hear the word sustainability everywhere. It's hard to find a real definition for that. The best that I have found is a sustainable society is one which satisfies its needs without diminishing the prospects of future generations. I've kind of incorporated some of the thoughts of others and some of my own thoughts here in what is a sustainable landscape. I think a sustainable landscape should have minimal maintenance cost. So since money is a resource, we should use it prudently. It should be carbon neutral or better. It should take carbon out of the atmosphere and not put carbon into the atmosphere. And if we're mowing lawns and using all that gas all the time, that may be unnecessary and harmful. It should be healthy for humans and animals. It should promote native biodiversity and should be bioregional, should reflect what happens in this unique ecology that we live in the Front Range. In general, conserve natural resources. It should be beautiful, aesthetically pleasing, and not promote an oppressive social hierarchy. And basically, the system that we've created for maintaining our landscapes is largely dependent on people who come from south of the border, who we don't pay what we consider a good wage or reasonable wage. We don't pay them benefits and give them health care and so on. And it would probably be a better world for everyone if they had a sustainable economy where they lived, and we created landscapes that weren't dependent on that kind of a labor force. This is a map of northern Colorado. There is where the High Plains Environmental Center is. So that's 34 and I-25. That's anticipated to be the epicenter of 500,000 people in a 20-mile radius at build-out. And that is a very high density. And that's why I refer to High Plains Environmental Center as being an urban environmental park. But what this map shows is on the left side, 80% of this area being green and 20% of it being purple, and on the right side, almost the complete opposite. And this map is a result of, back in the late 90s, there was referendum about restricting development in northern Colorado. And at that time, anyone who ever thought about developing their land ran out and got their land platted for development. And this map was the result of that. But it's a pretty good indicator of where the areas that will be built and what will be undeveloped, which is a pretty dramatic change for this area. And this is my last slide about development and resources and so on. But has anyone read the Diet for the Small Planet by Frances Moore Lappé? It was written in 1970, 1971. She was at the Sustainable Living Fair 2 years ago and is either working on a book or has finished a book called Liberation Ecology. So reframing these self-limiting paradigms that we use talking about sustainability and ecology, and reframing them in kind of a more positive way. I've seen bumper stickers that say, growing the economy is shrinking the environment. And I think that is a very, very narrow perspective. And this is what she says about it. Let's reframe growth for all that enhances life and go for more of it. Let's use growth to describe that which aligns with nature's rules to promote greater health, happiness, social and ecological vitality, resiliency, and the dispersal of social power. Now, I'm going to connect the 7 principles of xeriscaping to that outlook of sustainability and environmental stewardship. So the 7 principles of xeriscape are good landscape planning and design, low water use plants, appropriate turf areas, efficient irrigation, soil improvements, use of mulches, and appropriate maintenance. I don't know if everybody got the handout that goes with this, but it will be posted on the website, so you can download it. And I've basically taken the whole PowerPoint and everything that's written in this PowerPoint and saved it in the handout. So if you want this information, you don't have to necessarily take notes because it's all in that handout. These are some thoughts about how to begin landscape design process. And the first one is to really become acquainted with the site. As a landscape designer, one thing I fault people who are in this profession for is not spending enough time on the actual site, but to just look at it as a two-dimensional, on paper site, because every home and every landscape has completely different conditions. And I have heard that the landscape architect that designed the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center actually took his backpack and a sleeping bag and just went out and slept on the land for several days and just walked around and looked at the land and got a feel of the land and looked at what was naturally occurring there before anything got built. And I think that's very wise. Often people, when buying a brand new home, will want to have the landscape installed when they move in or shortly after they move in. And I can understand the reasoning for that, but at the same time, spending some time there and getting a feel for what actually happens on the site makes a lot of sense, because once you spend the money on installing a landscape and particularly a sprinkler system and so on, it's difficult and costly to change. And you may have missed subtleties about how the sunlight changes through the season and so on, and maybe areas of the landscape where you would want to be, others you would not want to be at various times of the day. The other one is to think regionally. This is the point that I've come back to a number of times. Think about where we live, and maybe hostas and delphiniums aren't really the best plants for this location. They grow great in Maine, though. Identify the desired activities and spaces that you want. Do you want lawns to play and recreate on, or just to see green? Do you want to have places to eat outdoors and grow vegetables, and places for pets that aren't necessarily the same as the human spaces and so on? So identify the activities you want to have in the landscape, and then design those into the landscape. Think about aspect, elevation, and microclimates. That's something that people think about in terms of managing large open spaces, but those exist in your own yard as well. Where would plants naturally grow If you just left your yard bare, not planting anything, 100 years later, when you came back, what would be growing there? Where would it be? Opportunities to harvest water from the topography. That's something that I'm going to explore in a further slide here. And group plants together that have similar requirements. That's one of the real keys to the Xeriscape design process, is to put plants together as they grow in nature, in communities with related requirements. Do they want to be in rich soil, well-drained, gravelly soil? Do they want to be wet? Do they want to be dry and shade and sun and so on? And plant that way. Botanic gardens and public gardens in the past have been more driven by what looks pretty with what, plant delphiniums with roses. And in the last few decades, there's been more of focus on grouping plants together for cultural reasons. Are they African plants? Are they Asian plants? Are they plants that are xeric plants or whatever? So the idea of putting plants together in communities the way they would occur in nature. And then planting to achieve density. I talked about plants in Maine will grow with huge leaves that here will grow with much smaller leaves. And the reason is the sun is 40% brighter here. Every 1,000 feet you go up in elevation, the sunlight is 5% more intense. So at 8,000 feet, it's 40% brighter. And leaves of lettuce grow very small unless you shade them, whereas they grow real large and juicy at sea level. So to achieve the kind of density that you see in the coffee table garden books, it's necessary to plant more closely here. Xeriscape doesn't have to disregard what has been learned over hundreds of years of landscape architecture, and I'm going to explore that. A garden is not just a bunch of plants. Design and maintenance are related. When you're designing your garden, you are designing your maintenance as well. When you put in a turf grass lawn, you are designing your Saturdays from now on for the rest of your life. So here we are with the bare ground and just, starting with a clean slate. And how do we proceed from this point? I designed these landscapes when I worked at Bath Nursery and Landscaping here in Fort Collins in the late 90s. You can see they're very much, they have a lot of grasses, a lot of perennials, and a lot of shrubs. They don't have a lot of grass, but the one in the upper left has no grass at all. It has some unmowed native grass. The one in the lower right, just in front of that area which is surrounding a pond, it does have a landing of grass that connects with a patio. So again, the idea of zoning and putting the grass where you want it closer in and having maybe further out more perennials and grasses than then larger shrubs in the outer concentric circle. I chose these pictures because I think that these are evocative of something that looks like a Colorado garden, just in terms of what plants grow here and how to achieve some sense of lushness in a garden here. This is an example of the zoning that I talked about. I identify the desired activities and spaces. So this is a plan that we did for the High Plains Environmental Center, and our office headquarters is in a what looks exactly like a residential house. It was a show house that McStain neighborhoods built to demonstrate the houses that they were building, and the High Plains Environmental Center was included in that building from the very beginning, and then we ended up buying the building. We had planned to change the landscape and designed in various uses, like a small turf area in the front and paths that connect the different parts of the garden and sitting areas and demonstration areas of various kinds. But the idea here is to design how you will enter and exit the garden and what kind of activities you want to do there. Just kind of build the garden toward those activities and uses. This is a picture probably taken from 12,000 feet up at Rocky Mountain National Park along Trail Ridge Road. What I really wanted to point out is this one rock that has the shadow. That's a microclimate. Things will grow in that shadow. I mean, a microclimate can be that small, this side of the rock versus that side of the rock. And if you look at your landscape, obviously the west side of your home is going to be very, very different experience for plants than the east side, and likewise the north and south. More different here than maybe in many other parts of the country. Obviously, it'll be extremely hot on the west side and dry and sunny in the winter. North will hold snow for a long period of time in the winter, so that kind of microclimate exists in your landscape and can be sort of heightened by placing rocks and large shrubs and trees and so on. So thinking ecologically about how your landscape is designed and where you place certain groupings of plants. And design and maintenance are interrelated. The upper right is Cornus stolonifera, the red twig dogwood. This time of the year it has the bright red canes. And this is a plant that will naturally grow 8 to 12 feet tall. But in the lower left here, someone has designed a landscape where this is growing under a window on the south side of a building. So this plant that likes to be in canyons and in forests and as understory in wet woodlands is now on the blazing hot side of a house and pruned within an inch of its life. So this plant isn't going to be very happy, and it's going to be prone to getting mites and other insect pests because it'll be struggling for its health for its entire lifetime. And it has to be pruned all the time, which is a lot of work and expensive to pay someone to do. And the plant isn't just going to be shown to its best. The way to prune these plants is to actually take the old canes and cut them right to the ground and let the newer red canes grow out, and they'll be bright red and showy at this time of the year. And then select out the older ones rather than just chopping them all down. So again, designing the landscape is actually designing a maintenance program. If you don't want to prune shrubs a lot, then put them in locations where they can have their natural shape and size, and choose small plants to go in small locations. One other thing about this too is people have a natural tendency to just cut shrubs down and keep them short. And we had red twig dogwood like this all along one side of the building. In fact, I can show you in this slide, all along the building on the north side, that row of shrubs are red twig dogwood. And they had been maintained before I got there 5 years ago as just 4-foot tall shrubs. And we just stopped pruning them at that point, and we haven't pruned them since, except taking out the old canes. And now they're about 8 feet tall, and they are a constant shelter for birds throughout the year. There's always lots and lots of birds in there, and urban birds need a place to go. And if we're pruning all of our shrubs down to 4 feet tall, we're kind of robbing them of anywhere to go. And birds can nest in a row of shrubs like this. I was referring to Ireland earlier, and the roadways in Ireland in the countryside are lined with hedgerows that like just thickets that grow up along the roads. And I've heard that they don't prune those thickets until after the middle of June because birds are having their nests and raising their young in there. And I always thought that was very polite to birds to treat them that way. So Denver Botanic Gardens, obviously a great horticultural resource for our region. And I included this slide because it looks like maybe the typical concept of Xeriscape, but this is the green roof that they put on top of their new bistro and area. The point here is it's a study in what Western native plants will thrive in. Green roofs are a lot easier to do from about Chicago eastward and much harder to do in the Rocky Mountain region. So this is really testing on what Western plants will grow in this kind of environment. But this is an example of how you can achieve density by planting plants more heavily. And if anyone has done it, the Denver Botanic Garden has definitely achieved a sense of lushness in their plant collection. They have the same climate as we do in our backyard, so if they can do it, we can do it as well. This is a picture of a meadow with native plants and grasses at High Plains Environmental Center. I included this because I mentioned that xeric plants, because they're Western native plants, they have a strategy of having often small petals and small flowers, or not flowers, small leaves. Large leaves grow in the jungle and at sea level where there's less sunlight. native plants don't want a lot of sunlight. They have plenty of sunlight already, so they have gray foliage which deflects sunlight, or small leaves that don't receive a lot of sunlight. When you have a lot of small flowers and a lot of small leaves and you don't have structure holding it all together, it just it doesn't have a lot of presence in terms of garden design. And I just wanted to compare that with, this is something that you can see in Centera and elsewhere, is using plants, even though they're native plants, like the little blue stem grass here. Those have been used in big sweeps at, down in Centera, along with Russian sage and other plantings, and planted at a kind of density that they have a lot of presence. And so using this kind of formal planting can be used in a xeriscape garden and with native plants as well. So that's reference to not having to necessarily disregard fundamental landscape design principles just because we're doing a xeriscape or native plant garden. Structure in gardens is important, particularly in a place like northern Colorado where we have 4 seasons. The structure of the garden remains throughout the year. Has anyone ever heard of Gertrude Jekyll and Edwin Lutyens? They were well known in the Craftsman period, late Victorian period in England, and Edwin Lutyens was a architect, and he created the walls and the walkways and the strong underlying geometry. And Gertrude Jekyll was an artist who designed the plantings of what has become known as the classic English perennial border. And those two things working together, the strong underlying geometry and the profusion of plants, is a powerful combination. And we can do that on a small scale in our own landscape as well. And simple themes can be very effective. I mean, obviously, this is a commercial landscape. It's in front of a Target store. But these Colorado blue spruce with the Russian sage, and I'm not sure what the shrub is behind, and then the Enothera, the evening primrose. I think that's a powerful combination. It's something that, along with the local flagstone there, it's simple and it holds up well. And I think using this large pieces like that in your landscape as the sort of background, with more of the intensive planting in the foreground, is an effective way to do it effectively and economically. I'm not going to read this whole thing, but Colorado water law declares that the state of Colorado claims the right to all moisture in the atmosphere that falls within its borders. So when a raindrop hits your roof, it already belongs to someone else. And there's been some discussion about the legislation in 2009 about, can you use rain barrels and cisterns in your home landscape or not? And according to this, unless someone has more recent information, this can only be done on residential property that uses a well or is legally entitled to a well, and the well permit is for domestic uses, and there's no water supply available in the area from a municipal or water district. The rain is collected only from the roof. The water is used only for those uses that are allowed by and identified on the well permit. So I wouldn't exactly say from that collecting the rainwater off of your roof is legal, but then again, the rainwater police are going to be awfully busy if they have to go to everyone's house to check. But there's another way, actually, of using rainwater that is perfectly legal in Colorado and has not been done as extensively in this part of the country as it's been done in other areas, and that is through passive water harvesting. And if you look at the photograph on the left, if you are traveling along the highway in the west, and you see a row of cottonwood trees, you know that there's a ditch or a river there. For a large geographical area, the rainwater will be collected and will drain to one watershed, and there you'll have completely different plants and much more intense and thick and tall plants like willows and cottonwoods and so on. So that same principle can be replicated in your home landscape. And the picture on the right is at Northern Water in Berthoud. And all of the plants in this photograph have never been watered. So you have yuccas and artemisia, native plants that are able to live with very little rainfall. But you also have some dogwoods in there growing in the same location. And the reason is that this planting is kind of a bowl shape. So whatever rainwater hits runs to the bottom of the bowl, and the dogwoods at the bottom are getting 4 or 5 times as much water. So instead of getting 10 inches of rain a year, they're getting 50 inches of rain a year. And this is something that can be done in your own landscape, as long as you're not stopping the water and holding it in a pond. It could run all through your landscape before it leaves to go to the stormwater drains. And this has been done to an incredible extent in Tucson, Arizona, where this genius, Brad Lancaster, has written a book called Rainwater Harvesting for Dry Lands and Beyond, which I highly recommend, or at least go to their website and see some of the examples. And again, the upper left photograph, you can see what it looks like right after a rainstorm. The lower right is what was grown on that, where they never, ever had an irrigation system. And this is in Tucson, Arizona. So never had an irrigation system, totally dependent on native rainfall and storing that water in the soil. Obviously, you can only do that with plants that are desert adapted, but that's part of the strategy as well. So one of the stories that I heard about this Brad Lancaster is that he took a saw and cut the curb on his sidewalk. And that curb is to keep the water running to storm drains, which go into culverts and underground to some river or watershed. So he cut into that and directed that storm water into his yard. And he excavated his yard to be a bowl shape and planted plants accordingly to what could grow in the wetter areas and what would grow on the edge of that. And the water would flow, and when it rained, into his yard, fill that bowl and sink into the ground. And very quickly he grew an oasis of Palo Verde and other shrubs and trees and so on. And it was a beautiful little park that people from his neighborhood would come to visit, and it was full of birds and so on. And the city found out that he had cut through this thing. So they came out to write him a citation, and he said, okay, well, hold on a minute. I look at this landscape here. This has never been watered, never once used city water on anything here. And as he explained what he did, the city began to think this was a really good idea. And now in Tucson, you can apply for this, and the city has a machine that they come out and they do the curb cut for you. So there's no stopping a good idea, I guess, is the moral of that story. Before we leave the topic of designing the landscape, I just want to bring your attention to some things that you can find online. The Plant Select, you probably all have heard about Plant Select with Denver Botanic Gardens and CSU and Colorado growers together have introduced a lot of plants for gardens in Colorado. Obviously, they're primarily low water use plants. And you can go onto the Plant Select site, plantselect.org, and download these plants and use them in your garden and for free. High Country Gardens is another place to get plants and even more information. They're in Santa Fe, New Mexico, and they have a lot of these Xeriscape designs too. I think these you have to buy, but you can buy like a whole package that tells you where to put the plants and so on. So these are kind of applicable particularly for smaller areas and redoing problem areas and hot areas and so on. This is a landscape design that I did for, the High Plains Environmental Center is a Plant Select site. And so one of the things that I always wanted to do is do basically the typical English perennial border using entirely Western native plants. And when I say you have to be careful with the word native, because native can mean native to Loveland or native to northern Colorado or the western North America. and I'm kind of using the latter usage. These are not European and Asian plants, but they're native to Western North America. And the logic, too, is our climate is changing. I mean, the USDA has just redesignated their map so that we're now in a different zone than we were 10 years ago, which means you can grow different plants here. And these plants may come from Arizona and northern New Mexico, but over time, they would naturally be coming our direction anyway, because we are not having the cold winters that we have had historically. The other logic, and this is a big thing that we keep coming back to at High Plains Environmental Center, is that native plants support native birds and butterflies. Native plants equal habitat. Native plants sustain the wildlife species they co-evolved with over millions of years. And there are some butterflies that can't live without certain plants and vice versa. And did anyone hear the story about the seeds for a wildflower that were discovered in Siberia recently by scientists drilling in the ice? Found these seeds and they grew the seeds. So they have this little beautiful white wildflower that is basically a museum piece. Because unless the moth or the bee or whatever that is down there in ice too, this flower cannot be released into the wild. Because I do know in Texas at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, I learned there are 600 species of bees in Texas. And no one knows all the relationships between which bees go with which plants, but it's very intricate. And without the plants, the bees go away and vice versa. Some plants can only be pollinated by certain bees. So there's this intrinsic relationship between the pollinators and the plants. And by growing the plants, we are also saving the native pollinators, and in particular, the butterflies like this, the painted lady. So this is our Xeriscape and Plant Select garden. And as I mentioned, we're only interested in growing the portion of the Plant Select plants that are Western native plants. There's a lot of perfectly good plants in the Plant Select palette that are from South Africa and places in Asia and Europe. But we've chosen just to work with the Western native plants. So I'm just going to go through these quickly, show you some of our favorites. Mojave Sage. Is anyone here growing this plant? Mojave Sage. It has really fragrant foliage, and this is a plant that likes it dry, 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 and hot, hot, hot. And once you get it established, even very, very xeric plants need to be watered while they become established. If they were growing out in the wild, they grow from seed, and they'd come up in the right season. They'd put down tap roots really quickly, and a lot of them wouldn't survive. But when you take a containerized plant and you stick it in the ground, you have to support it through at least the first season to get it established, including plants like this. But it has beautiful kind of pinkish mauve flowers and fragrant foliage that smells like sage. Canna Creek buckwheat, you can see the honeybee on this. It's very attractive to bees, and this is a native to here in Colorado. And it's actually like a little shrub that's evergreen. And in the wintertime, the foliage will remain like a kind of a purple leaves that green up again in the spring. And the agastache, this is a very commonly used native, although only very recently has this really been introduced. I understand from Panchito Manzanita at the Denver Botanic Garden that this actually only grew, its native range was a very small area in Arizona, and it's become very popular. And this is a fantastic hummingbird plant. This is also called Hummingbird Mint. And the other cool thing about these is they actually grow in the time of the year that's always been sort of a gap for gardeners. You get all the European and Asian plants like the irises and peonies and so on that bloom in June, and they're fantastic. But later in July and August, there's fewer things that bloom, and these just rage through that time of the year. You're guaranteed to have hummingbirds if you have these plants. So this one is the Agastache rupestris, the sunset hyssop. And this one is the Sonoran Sunset, which is more of a kind of purpley pink. And if you had to name this plant, what would you call it? The Denver Cold Columbine. Columbines, you probably know if you grow them in your garden, get kind of weary looking when the weather gets hot. This particular one holds up for a long time. And if you happen to grow it at a elevation like Red Feather Lakes, these just blaze through the whole season. And they're really tough plants that they will spread around in your garden as well and reproduce themselves. This is an example. The Pikes Peak Purple is a Penstemon. It's from Penstemon mexicali. It's a hybrid of Penstemon mexicali. Also wanted to point out on this, if you have these, the bumblebees are native bees, whereas the honeybees are not. They're European bees. But the bumblebees are very, very attracted to this. And you'll see them going in and out happily all day long in these flowers. And some flowers, I'm not sure about these exact ones, but can only be pollinated by the buzz of the bumblebee. So it takes the actual vibration of the buzzing to pollinate the flower, which is kind of cool. Apache plume. This is an interesting plant. As I mentioned, very, very small leaves. It grows in Arizona and New Mexico and southern Colorado. Has very small leaves because it grows in a bright, sunny place where it doesn't need more sunlight than it's getting for photosynthesis. And it has white flowers about the size of a quarter that kind of look like small roses. But the Apache plume part of it is after the flower, there's a little puff of the seeds that looks like a little eagle plume. This is one for a very hot, dry location. And this has become very popular recently, the Panchito Manzanita. This plant in the picture is very young, but they'll actually get a spread of 3 to 5 feet across. And we don't have the rhododendrons and azaleas here in Colorado, but this is our sort of answer to azaleas and rhododendrons because it has beautiful pink flowers in the spring. And this is one of our few native broadleaf evergreens. So it keeps that hard green leaf throughout the winter. And this is a plant that you don't want to put in the wind, strong wind, bright sun if it's not in the wind. But this tends to be desiccated in the winter because it has that leaf surface that can get dried out by the sun and the wind. Most ericaceous plants like this and the kinnikinnick, also back east, the azaleas and rhododendrons, these kind of plants need a lot of oxygen at their root zone, so you don't want to bury them deep in clay soil. In fact, if I were planting this, I would throw a shovel full of gravel and dig that up and plant it in a little hillock that's above the grade, because they want to be high and dry, or not dry so much, but they want to have good air exchange in their roots. This is a native shrub, the Cercocarpus intricatus, the true leaf mountain mahogany. I think this is also native to southern Colorado or the western slopes. These kind of needle-like leaves will stay on in a mild winter. In a very, very cold winter, they'll drop them, but they'll come back out in the spring. And it has a really interesting contorted form as it gets older. I think on Meldrum Street in Old Town, there's a couple of these that are quite old, or maybe it's Mason Street near the courthouse. And anyway, they're large and they're really contorted. They kind of look like the Mediterranean olive plants. Really cool. Usually, unfortunately, though, in neighborhood HOAs, prune these in the kind of green meatball form, so you never really see that. This is the prairie load sundrops that are actually native to our Callilophus, which is native to our area. This is another one that's going to be very, very happy blooming where it's hot and dry and blooms all summer long. Fern bush, this is maybe one of, I think, the best native shrub that you see very rarely in landscapes. But this is a bulletproof shrub. I've never seen it heat stressed at all. Has these large groupings of white flowers and very lacy fern-like foliage. Really a cool deciduous shrub. And the prairie jewel penstemon, this is a native penstemon that native really to a little bit east of here, eastern Colorado and Nebraska and Kansas. And these come in a range of colors from white through pink to dark purple. And the Vermilion Bluff Sage, if I actually had this flower here, a cool thing that you can do with these flowers, particularly a large salvia like this, is I'll have to show this to kids who come and visit our garden, because they'll do a little snake bite trick. If you put a little stick or something down kind of in the throat of the flower, the stamens will come down like a snake's fangs, and that's a kind of mechanical response that they have for pollinating. So whatever hummingbirds or whatever puts its beak in there, it'll come down and just tag it with the pollen. And here's another agastache, the Coronado, with the blonde ambition grama grass. The blue grama is actually our state grass. This is one that was discovered by High Country Gardens that they found growing about 30 inches tall. It turns sort of a yellow color. So this is really cool, and this is one that we tried last year for the first time. This is Red Rocks Penstemon, another Penstemon Mexicali hybrid that's just kind of more into the pink color range. This one has a honeybee in it. And Salvia Greggi, which is native to southwest Texas and northern Mexico. I wanted to mention this book. I don't know if this is in your collection, but this is the Plant Select book on that really goes in depth into growing these plants. And this is a great gardener's companion for this area. So you can order it from the Plant Select site, although it's been out of print, I think, for a while. Now we are up to number 3 on the 7 principles of Xeriscape, and that is appropriate turf areas. I'm going to have to confess at this point, or maybe you got this from my slides of Ireland. I love green grass, and one of the things about going to the east is everything looks like this, whether it was intended to or not. But in this is City Park here in Fort Collins, and this is where kids play soccer. And I think that having maybe the entire city park doesn't have to be irrigated turf. Maybe it would be cool if there was some restored shortgrass prairie there, or at CSU. CSU is the sustainability university, and yet you'll find acre after acre after acre of irrigated grass there. This has its place, and this place is probably in a city park, and not in medians going down in a 4-lane road with a strip of grass in the median down the middle. So the idea of how to use this in a xeriscape design is really zoning the grass and just having grass where you need it, and not having this be the kind of fallback answer to all things landscaping. And here's an example at the High Plains Environmental Center. In the back of our building, we had this little green area that adjacent to the sidewalk, and if you wanted to go out and sit on the grass or whatever. We have subsequently killed this grass and put some crusher fines and a bench and some large whiskey barrels with Plant Select plants in them. So it's very colorful, but it's not green anymore. But I think that is in terms of proportion of irrigated turf grass in a home landscape, that's probably not a bad proportion. Turf type fescue uses about half the amount of water required to sustain Kentucky bluegrass. And the reason is it's a grass that, it's a coarser grass, and it goes much, much deeper. So its roots will be down a couple of feet, and it can go deeper for water. It's able to go longer without water. The only thing about this grass is kids who play on the grass typically don't like this because it has a different texture. Kentucky bluegrass is very soft, and Kentucky bluegrass is a stoloniferous grass. Anyone who has ever played golf and taken a chunk of grass out knows that you can just stick it back in and the grass will knit back together. This will not do that. This is not a stoloniferous grass. An advantage here is you can cut an edging in fescue grass and it won't go into your shrub and perennial beds because it doesn't creep along the ground the same way that the bluegrass does. However, if you scuff out this grass, then you have to actually reseed it or put plugs in or something because it won't heal itself that way. An interesting story about native grasses in suburban and urban communities. A few years ago, I heard a story about a town in the Denver area. I'm not sure exactly which one, but they would do Xeriscape designs for homeowners who asked for them and give them the design and help them in order to lower water consumption in the city. So they designed a landscape for a couple, and it turned out so well that it became sort of like the poster boy for this program. So they would hold up this picture of this beautiful landscape with pinyon pines and perennials and blue grama grass and say, like, this is how good your landscape can look, and it's Xeriscape and low water use. Then we had a rainy year in Colorado, and the grass got taller than 10 inches tall. Well, blue grama grass is also not a stoloniferous grass. It has to go to seed in order to fill in and replicate itself. And it's what it does. It doesn't look good when you mow it within an inch of its life. So the neighbors complained about the grass was too tall. The city went to this family and said, we'll write you a citation if you don't mow your grass. And the homeowner said, you told us to plant this grass. And we are doing what is culturally appropriate for this grass. So we haven't quite come to terms with how to deal with this grass. Because of this stricture about having to mow grass that was taller than 8 inches tall, it kind of rules out using native grasses in some places. Just also wanted to point out this picture in the upper left is the restored prairie at the Denver Botanic Garden. And I think it would be terrific if people's front yards looked like that. This is what happens when you overmow native grasses. So basically, if you're going to use buffalo grass and blue grama grass, let it be what it is. Don't try and turn it into Kentucky bluegrass because you're not going to be happy with the results. And one of the reasons you don't see more native lawns around is that there's so few have been done well. And if we've planted native grass at all, and we're mowing it 3 inches tall, like Kentucky bluegrass, you're going to have a horrific mess like this. And it's, no one's going to like the way that looks. So the lesson here is let it be what it is. This is my neighbor's grass. It's right across the street from my house. And I watched for an entire year. Our neighbor, Michelle, is from New Mexico, loves the look of this blue grama grass, which, as I mentioned earlier, this is our state grass. It's a warm season grass. They spent months and months getting rid of all the weeds and preparing the soil, and then they seeded the grass when the bindweed wasn't coming up anymore. And they really did that right by getting rid of all the weeds before they started. They got it all cleaned up. They started their grass. It came in beautifully, incredibly well. It's a warm season grass. You can only really start it in the warm season, May, June, and maybe July if you have irrigation and can get it established quickly. If you seed it too late, it won't be established enough and it can be killed by the frost. So you really want to start it in the early summer or late spring. So they did a beautiful job, got an incredible stand of grass. This is how it looked in the second year. This is in July. You can hardly tell the difference between their grass and their neighbor's grass behind who are watering it like it's on fire every day. This grass has never been watered. And if I could show you across the street, there's kochia. Does everyone know what kochia is? An annual weed that the slightest amount of rain will cause that weed to come up. Across the street is a front lawn that's entirely kochia, but it's 2 inches tall. So some people from the city of Fort Collins came, wrote a citation for our neighbors, said you have to mow your grass. The 2-inch tall kochia across the street was totally fine. And so I rode a soapbox for the Coloradoan about this grass. And then I had a discussion with some people at a fairly high level in city planning about the grass. And they said, we need to rethink this and maybe rewrite the language about this ordinance. But my neighbor sort of squeaked by because it also says that you can have 80% of your landscaping can be ornamental grasses. So this is kind of came out under that heading. The point is not pointing the finger at the city of Fort Collins or anybody, just saying that we need to come to terms with growing native grass and what it means, and that it's okay to have native grass, basically, and that that's suitable for Colorado. And it's something that in a kind of suburban context, it's difficult to do because there's a lot of pushback about this looking the way it does. But personally, I think it's beautiful and it's suitable for our region, and I'd like to see a lot more of it. This is not a commercial for Monsanto. All I want to say here is if you're starting in a new landscape, the time to eradicate your weeds, whether you choose to use herbicides or not, is before you plant. Don't plant your blue grama grass lawn over bindweed, because you're not going to be happy. And what's going to end up happening is the native warm season grasses will not green up until May or June, as I mentioned, the warm season. But weeds like dandelions and curly dock and Canada thistle and so on, they green up very, very early. So you're going to see bright, bright green weeds in brown grass, and no one will be happy with that. But also wanted to point out that most landscapes that you see were intended from day one. They were intended to have a continual supply of soluble nitrogen and herbicides through their entire lifetime, not just getting them started, but were intended to be basically maintained through chemicals. So I think there's a big difference between getting your ground healthy, eradicating invasive plants, and starting over again, and establishing something that will compete with weeds versus just planning on using herbicide forever without end. Just a few brief comments about irrigation, and I have this on the handout as well. A lot of people make the mistake of watering their turf grass too much, and what ends up happening is it becomes very weak and lazy. When the water level is very high, roots come to the surface. There's some places where I've seen people water so much that the roots actually come up out of the ground because they're drowning. And so what you want the roots to do is go deep into the ground. And the way that you do that is to water deeply and infrequently, and starve your grass for water and put the roots deep. And then when you water infrequently and deeply. And the way to water deeply is to run short cycles of your sprinkler system and repeatedly for a period of time. So if you have those, the pop-up sprays that are in the lower left there, those pop-up sprays will put a lot of water out in 5 or 10 minutes, whereas rotors might take 5 minutes just to make one rotation. So you're not getting very much water from those. So the more you just have one spray of water that goes around, it's going to take a long time. Those are intended to hit a larger area, but it takes a longer amount of time to cover. These pop-ups will put more water out faster on a smaller area. But in either case, you could water at night and do like 3 cycles, depending on how long which you have, of like 5 to 20 minutes. And so that's like a rainy night. That's really getting water deep in the ground. And if you just run that one area constantly, it's going to exceed the soil's ability to absorb the water, and the water's just going to run off, and you'll be wasting water. Have people been to visit Northern Water in Berthoud? Not many people have heard of it. This place is a incredible facility. It took a lot of money to build, and it's very underutilized. But you could learn anything you ever wanted to know about irrigation if you go to this site. So how to irrigate and And they've done a lot of different experiments with different kinds of grasses, different kinds of soil preparations, so you can see the difference. Look at the grass in the foreground and look at the grass in the background. Those are both watered exactly the same. Why do you think they're different? Same amount of water. They told me, Brent Meekum, who was the director of this garden, was leading that tour that you see in the background, and he explained what was going on in each of these plots. On that plot, they parked the construction equipment for a year while this garden was being built. And then they intended, when you're doing a construction project, you intend to do things and they don't always get done. They intended to decompact that by ripping it with a machine that had big teeth to loosen up the soil. But they didn't do it. They just sodded it just like the rest of them. And then they had an area that's so compacted it can't absorb water. And if you have a new home or if you're building a new home, this is very, very important because your builder has been driving all over that, and all kinds of contractors, painters, and sheetrockers and so on have been all over that ground and dumping all kinds of stuff on it and so on. And then it's very compacted. And if you don't alleviate that compaction, then it doesn't matter how much water you put on there. If you have a patch of soil or grass in part of your yard, and it gets water just like every other part of it, but it just will never be green. Could be a situation like this where it's just really compacted, and no matter how much water you put on, it can't penetrate the soil. If you look at the picture in the bottom, that pile of soil, this is what happens in a lot of suburban developments, is they scrape off all the top soil, they put it in a big pile, 20 feet high, they drive big earth-moving machinery on top of it, pack it down, and it sits there for a year or two, and then they spread that out again all over the yards in the homes that they build, and that soil's all dead. So it doesn't matter what you plant in there, your soil's dead, because 98% of native biodiversity is in the soil itself, and it can't live in deeper than 2 feet into the ground. So it's been starved of oxygen, and the critical microorganisms that are the kind of beneficial helpers of the plants and their roots are gone. So no matter what fertilizer you put on there, it can't be absorbed into the plant. And so you're going to have to use a lot of pesticides and fertilizers and so on, and basically your landscape's going to be on life support. So it's very important in a new home or a place where you feel like your soil has been sort of starved of oxygen to add mycorrhiza, which I'm going to explain in just a minute. The other thing, in the upper right, you see all that patch of weeds? That's a dairy farm that's very near the environmental center. This is a common source of compost for landscaping in this area. And typically they recommend putting 3 to 5 yards of compost on your soil before you plant. So on the left there, they're spreading that compost around. But look where it came from. And it came from a place that's like basically a weed farm. And then you're taking that and you're spreading that over your whole landscape. So you're going to have to use a lot of, again, a lot of herbicides and so on, because you just inoculated the entire landscape with weeds. So you have dead soil with lots of weeds, and that's not a good starting point. So the answer to the dead soil situation is inoculating it with mycorrhiza. And this is something that you can buy at local nurseries. And what it is, it's living microorganisms that you can put into the soil, and they will proliferate in the soil. And what they do, did you ever pull up roots and see like this kind of like white spongy part of the roots? That's actually not the plant. That's an extension of the plant's root system. That's this beneficial fungus. And what happens a lot of times when trees are overwatered, a tree specialist might come out and say, oh, well, this tree died from armillaria, shoestring fungus. And that's not actually what killed it. The soil got starved because there was too much water. The mycorrhiza died, which are the mycorrhiza kind of keep pathogens from attacking the plant. they died off. They make it possible for the plant to assimilate nutrients, which it can't do anymore. And so basically that tree didn't have a chance, and the shoestring fungus just finished it off. So the microbial life in the soil is critical and much more necessary to native plants and xeric plants than fertilizer. So it's not so much an issue of putting a lot of chemical fertilizer and so on for your plants, or even compost, but this is very important. So in a lot of cases, our soils here on the Front Range and here in Colorado are very similar from area to area around Fort Collins. There's very little difference. In some places there's more of that cobblestone and gravel, but mostly it's clay all over Fort Collins. And a lot of times what you have to do is loosen up the soil, build little berms to plant your desert plants on, because a lot of these water-loving plants are from Arizona and really dry places. So make your soil grittier, make your soil better drained, and look to the mycorrhiza, and don't worry so much about nitrogen and putting a lot of compost. You don't want the plants to be, plants that are big and green and leafy need a lot of nitrogen, but these plants that have been growing in the desert on very dry mineral soils don't need that. In fact, it's been demonstrated in a lot of landscape restorations that nitrogen will encourage invasive non-native plants and don't particularly benefit the native plants. In terms of mulching the ground, one of my pet peeves is I see a lot of places that have weed barrier and bark mulch on top of it. And basically, when you put bark mulch on top of the weed barrier, it's gonna, tomorrow you're gonna wake up and that mulch is gonna be in Laramie, Wyoming, because it can't adhere to the ground at all, and it just gets sort of peeled off of the weed barrier. Again, there's a thing about the bark mulch can lock up nitrogen in the soil. If you've ever gone to a composting class or you've studied how to compost, you basically you put 3 parts nitrogen and 1 part carbon, or 3 brown and 2, or I'm saying that, yeah, I'm saying that right. 3 parts green, 1 part brown. So the rain falls and it hits the particles of bark. It adheres to the bark and gets evaporated back into the sky. But if you use something like the pea stone gravel or some kind of rock, water will go right through that rock to the plants. And so more of the water actually gets through to the plants. And our native plants seem to really like this as a ground cover. Some tests were done, again, at Northern Water, that they found that the temperature on a day that's in the 90s, the temperature on top of that rock was about 140 degrees, but underneath the rock it was the exact same temperature as the bark mulch. So it actually keeps the ground cool underneath just the same as the bark mulch does. If you can see this well, I actually took this picture with my iPhone this morning when I went out and walked, and there's some people who live near my house who I think have an incredible landscape. This is that Panchito Manzanita that I was talking about. But look at the different sizes of rock that they've put together. It's all a sort of a buff color, but there's tiny, tiny little particles and pea stone size, and pieces that are up to about 1 inch. And I just think that really, that mulch itself looks good, and it looks like, looks very natural, and yet it's very sort of neat and orderly at the same time. And just a few comments about maintaining the landscape. During the growing season, I'll confess that I'm a very lazy gardener, and I don't like pushing a lawnmower, and we don't mow grass at my house. We have an extensive perennial garden with shrubs and grasses and native plants and xeric plants and so on. It's very colorful, but I don't really spend a lot of time tending that in the summer. I go out and I cut it all back around this time of the year and clean up the leaves from last year and cut back all the old dead growth. Wanted to mention about pruning. To know if you have shrubs, if they bloom on old wood or new wood. And that means that some things like buddleia and roses will grow on the new wood, what grows from the ground this spring. But other things like lilacs and forsythia will bloom on old wood that they grew last year. So after your lilacs bloom or forsythia, prune them. And the new growth that comes after that will set buds for the following year. But in the winter or early spring, cut back things like the butterfly bush, because that's going to bloom on new wood. So it's worth knowing, like a common mistake on hydrangeas is cutting them back to the ground in the spring, which means you just basically cut all the flowers off because they bloom on old wood. So that's something that you need to know. And in terms of, I was reading on the Denver Water site where they said, you'll still need to use pesticides and so on. I've never used any pest control in my garden. And I think that if the plants are in healthy soil and they're the right plant in the right location, they won't have problems. And if they do have problems, those problems will correct themselves. Other, like predatory insects, will eat the pest insects and so on. So I don't put a lot of stock in using pesticides. In a healthy landscape, just like a healthy person, we shouldn't need to take a lot of medicine and so on if we have a healthy lifestyle and good diet and so on. Same thing applies to plants. We don't have to, really over-medicate them. One thing to know, though, in terms of spreading diseases from one plant to another, if you're pruning and you're moving from one plant to another, and particularly from one species of plant to another, you can just clean your pruning shears by spraying them with Clorox bleach. And if you have something like fire blight, which particularly hits things like crab apples, and you cut that out and you go and cut other plants, you could actually be communicating that from plant to plant. So I'm not big on the hand sanitizer kind of mentality, but in this situation, it actually does do a lot of good to not communicate that from one plant to another. And then after frost, don't be in a hurry to rush out and rake up all the leaves and cut everything back, because Denver has more freeze-thaw cycles than any other city in the United States, and so presumably that would apply to Fort Collins as well. And so what happens is the old foliage and the old stems on your grasses and perennials will shade the ground, and it's stressful for plants to freeze and thaw every day, and it can push plants out of the ground, it can dry plants out, and as you know, it's very dry. It can be very dry in the winter here. So that little bit of foliage can shade the ground, keep it frozen, keep it from getting dried out, and you'll be much better off. And besides, I heard a talk by Helen Dillon, a well-known Irish gardener who came to Denver Botanic Garden and commented how incredible gardens look here in the winter, because everything just gets freeze-dried, whereas in places where they have a lot of snow and rain and sort of bleak weather, the plants get all sort of mushy and pushed down, and they're just kind of a rotten mess by the spring. But they'll just, like our plants, just freeze dry in place, and it's kind of cool to look at, basically a dried flower arrangement version of your summer garden, and it protects the garden as well. Also wanted to mention winter watering. I mean, anyone who's been a gardener in Colorado knows that more plants die in the winter than any other time, because we shut off our drip irrigation and shut off sprinklers and so on, and maybe don't think about how dry it is out there. But new plants in particular, and really even a xeriscape garden, will benefit from being watered at least once a month in the wintertime. Because what happens is we may have them on drip irrigation, or we get summer rains and so on, and then you go through a long period of time in the winter without any moisture, and everything can get dried out, and it can kill your valuable plants. And that is my last slide. That's my garden. I was actually going to put peonies all shredded by hail, but I thought I'd spare you that one, because that's all, it happens all enough on its own. Does anyone have any questions or any comments about anything that we've seen? The problem with bindweed, from what I hear, the bindweed that you pull is growing from a tuber that's about the size of a watermelon that can be 40 to 60 feet away. So it's very hard. The interesting thing about bindweed, and thinking maybe in terms of like ecological restoration, because I manage a couple hundred acres of restored natural areas, and it actually is not that much of a problem in densely planted and well-established plants. I mean, it'll always keep coming up in your garden, but the more, it's actually not that competitive, and tends to form a solid mat when there's nothing else around. But I think the herbicide that kills that is dicamba, but it's one of the more toxic herbicides. The bindweed is a tough one, though. I mean, you can kind of, in a very localized way, smother it with black plastic or something like that, but just bear in mind that plant, it can come back because it's growing from a root that's not harmed by that smothering at all. Thank you very much.